TradeSquare is Australia's first business-to-business marketplace connecting people, brands and organisations into this diverse ecosystem in a unique global landscape. Through pivoting, transforming and reshaping, Australian businesses have an opportunity to create the model for the future that aligns with the world's needs and leveraging the power of a collaborative approach. Through the TradeSquare podcast, we will bring together dynamic, diverse and thought-provoking leaders from business, government and organisations to have conversations to further enable new thinking for the future. Welcome to TradeSquare, Australia's first B2B marketplace, enabling business growth through digital transformation. We're joined today by Victor Perton, the Chief Optimism Officer at the Centre for Optimism. How are you?
Oh, I'm extremely well, Catherine. And what's the best thing happening for you?
Well, there's lots. Back in Sydney, there's a day of sunshine for the first time in about 10 days. So I'm excited to spend some time outdoors today rather than sitting under the torrential rain in gloomy skies, really.
Well, we're the opposite. We've had a beautiful weather through Christmas and New Year, but the last couple of days it's been bucketing rain. But of course, in Australia, bucketing rain is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Absolutely, particularly after our 2019-2020 chaos of bushfires. I think any form of rain is welcome.
Yeah, and one of the issues in Australia is even though we've got desalination in Melbourne and Sydney and Perth and Adelaide, people still have this notion of a scarcity mentality. So it's constantly back to conservation and reduction rather than how can we use water to better our society.
And so tell us, who is Victor Perton?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I don't think I've ever been asked that. So I am the Chief Optimism Officer of the Centre for Optimism, but that hides a lot of complexity. So I'm the son of refugees from Lithuania and Latvia who came to Australia in the 1950s. I was born here. In fact, the generation before that had it very tough. So if we go back the generation before, my grandfather was executed by the Soviets, my grandmother to the Gulag, my other grandparents were refugees from 1940. So we're a family that knows that life can be tough, but then arriving in Australia, a blessed land, where people are friendly, people trust people generally. And so I started out my working life, obviously doing some jobs at school and the like as a builder's labourer. But my first professional job, I was a barrister. And then after that, I became a member of the State Parliament in Victoria. And 18 years rushed by. I really enjoyed it. But 2006, I'd had enough of it. I could see that politics was becoming increasingly negative. And, whilst I'm good, as a barrister and a debater, I'm good at the negative stuff. I don't like the negative stuff. So there was a lot less positive and a lot more negative. So I left and then did a few entrepreneurial things. And then out of the blue, I was asked to become a Trade and Investment Commissioner in North and South America. So that was an extraordinary time. Everywhere I went, there was this incredible positive prejudice towards me as an Australian. The chairman of one of the largest agricultural companies said, "You Aussies remind the Americans of 100 years ago. Nothing is impossible." And then after that, I fell on my feet even more. I was one of the senior advisors to the Australian G20 presidency. So the G20 is now the world's most important economic policy body, meeting at head of state level. And that, again, an extraordinary stereotype of us as Australians as positive and trustworthy. And then, for personal reasons, I came back to Melbourne in 2015 and was astonished by the change in language of Australians. It had become a very bleak and negative language, and particularly for me, it was a bleak and negative language around leadership. And having come back from America, and obviously I'd changed from living in San Francisco, but Australia had changed even more. So rather than complain about the complainers, I set up the Australian Leadership Project, and we interviewed 2,500 people on the qualities of Australian leadership. And if I could summarise them for you and your listeners, Catherine, it's egalitarianism. An Australian leader should talk to the cleaner in the same way they talk to the chairman, and often we're politer to the cleaner than we are to the chairman. Self-effacing humour, and we take our work seriously and we laugh at ourselves. And then thirdly, no bullshit, plain speaking. Now, if those are the three qualities of Australian leadership, there's millions of people like that. It's why Australians live so well. So at the end of the research project, I was left as bewildered as I was at the beginning by the negativity. And then my eureka moment came late in 2017, where I figured out it actually wasn't much of a problem with the leadership. I mean, everyone can be better. You can be better. I can be better, Catherine. The problem is the fog of pessimism. And Australia and New Zealand, coming from what used to be the most optimistic countries on earth, and the global stereotype of us is that we're just inexhaustibly optimistic. The reality in Australia and New Zealand is that the language has become quite negative and pessimistic. And we see it in statistics like the number of people on anti-anxiety and anti-depression drugs. And so I set up, a long story, but I set up the Centre for Optimism, and we're just reaching our first birthday. We're sending our first renewals for membership. And it's, in the middle of COVID and the like, I think we've really found that, several thousand people in 69 countries find us a very worthwhile enterprise. Now, that's a long answer to a short question.
That is a long answer, but so many layers of interesting things. So thanks for sharing that. So tell me more about the Centre for Optimism.
So our fundamental practice is to ask people the question, what makes you optimistic? So we believe that optimism is a state of mind, not a state of the world. So in asking people what makes them optimistic, we're not preaching, we're not saying you should be happier because we've halved the rate of malaria, or, we've solved the problem of world poverty or the like. Because, as you and I talked about before we started the formal interview, people have grief, people lose jobs, businesses go bankrupt. These are all parts of life. And what is it that makes you optimistic? And so we work with a definition of optimism that goes back some 700 or 800 years to Mother Julian of Norwich, who famously said, all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. And Harvard, the American military, Oxford, and others all use the definition of optimism, that it's a belief that good things will happen and that things will work out in the end. And to which some people add, and if it hasn't worked out, it's not the end. So fundamentally, we ask people what makes you optimistic, and we've done that to presidents, prime ministers. We do it in workshops, in prison, in schools, in universities, in conferences, in major corporates. And we also foster what we call realistic and infectiously optimistic leadership. I think the consensus of smart people around the world is, look, you can read 70 or 80 leadership books and, there's probably 150 qualities of the good leader. But what we need in 2021, leading out of the pandemic into a better normal, are leaders who are realistic and infectiously optimistic. And that doesn't mean the woman or man making the big speech from the podium on how good they are or how good the company is. It's the person who can unlock the optimism in the team. So, we've had to be very much online this year, and we've now got almost 5,000 members and subscribers in 69 countries. So we do a lot of events online. We have now what is the biggest website on optimism in the world, with wisdom, writings, research. We research what makes people optimistic. We research the relationship between strategy and optimism, innovation and optimism. We've done a major research project on how people's lives have improved during COVID, what we call a better normal. People don't necessarily want to go back into the office. They do like working from home, or they do prefer a hybrid model. And so, it's we're still evolving. We're a year old, but that would be a reasonable summary of what we do. We're a research centre, we're an education centre, and most importantly, we're a gathering place for optimists. One of the best pieces of advice you get from people like Bill George at Harvard and the like is surround yourself with positive people. You've got to spend time, the negative, they may be family members, they may be people you work with, but when you make a choice as to who you can be with, you should surround yourself with optimists.
And so what's one thing that makes you optimistic?
What makes me optimistic is asking people every day, what makes you optimistic? So, Catherine, we start thinking, because I'm going to ask you the question after this. So for me, the longer pieces I've written on it really goes back to that first question you asked me, who are you, Victor Perton? So for me, there's a bit of innate optimism. I think there's some genetics in it. When I look at the background of my family, the tough times they went through, but they came through being infectiously optimistic and lifting other people. So I've been fortunate to see, genuine suffering and genuine hardship and see people come through that. And then secondly, it's the research I do in optimism. I understand that optimism is good for your health. There's findings that optimism is the major trait that indicates longevity, heart health, cancer recovery, even Alzheimer's and the like. And it's the underpinning of good work. So for me, I think it's a mixture of nature and nurture. And I nurture my optimism every day by nurturing others. And as Gandhi said, I mean, in broad terms, the only person you can change is yourself. And coming back to what you do, which is asking good questions, I find that in asking good questions of other people, I lift myself. And I don't know if you've ever met Megumi Miki, the Japanese Australian author, but when I asked her what makes you optimistic, I said to Megumi, what makes you optimistic? She said to me, just in asking me the question, you lifted me. So again, I guess, Sophie, what makes Victor Perton optimistic? Nature, nurture, and every day asking someone what makes you optimistic. So, Catherine, what makes you optimistic?
I think I would have to say here, I've just finished reading this amazing book called One Life. And it's the journey of going from a happy life to a meaningful life. And I think the whole notion of meaning really makes me optimistic, because I feel like if we can create meaningful humans in meaningful organizations doing meaningful work, we're actually creating a much more sound universe in all aspects of, people, place, and planet. So for me, what makes me optimistic is the journey towards creating the most meaningful life that I can, surrounded by wonderful people who are that positive influence and do help and support me to grow at every level. For me, it's really about meaning.
And that's brilliant. I mean, you go back to books like The Search for Meaning, and you even look at some contemporary studies. They looked at people over the age of 100 in Italy who were still active in, public or community life. What were the two traits? They were purpose and optimism. So, one of the theories in Australia is that life has become so easy here, and the collapse of religion and faith generally. People are having trouble finding purpose and meaning. And, if that's your mission, Catherine, and you do it by asking these brilliant questions and helping people to make greater sense of collaboration in B2B, again, like Gandhi, you've changed yourself, and in changing yourself, you are going to lift other people around Australia, New Zealand, and around the world. So it's a brilliant mission you're embarked on, Catherine.
So thinking about people, as you just mentioned before, and obviously people play such an integral role in transforming Australian businesses. Can you give me some examples of where you've seen wonderful humans in the last 12 months really step up to the challenges of what's been happening in the world?
So we've seen, I think, this year, you have to say that the central role goes to the people working in infectious diseases. So I think the world was generally underprepared for a pandemic, even though we've had movies and books and the like predicting pandemics for decades. I think we were underprepared. And so we saw epidemiologists, change their role from quiet people in laboratories to public figures helping us make sense of wearing masks and staying at home and making sense of staying at home. Um, one of the roles of COVID was, it scared 6 out of 7 billion people on Earth. And there were 100 million smart people, who could work on something like 250 candidate vaccines. 3 or 4 of them already approved for global release in the last month. So to see the scientists, and I've had the opportunity to interview some of the ones in Melbourne and Ireland and beyond. So I think number one, for me in this year has been to see the scientific community collaborating with the commercial sector, collaborating with venture capital to bring new medicines to world usage in record short time. And then, the second group of people in these scary times is, what's now called frontline workers. But, the ambulance drivers, the people in hospital emergency, the people working in ICU, the people, it hasn't happened in Australia, but watching America and Europe, the people setting up emergency hospital facilities outside of hospitals and the like. And, to see that courage. And then at the simpler level, just people in neighbourhoods, people, checking in on their neighbours, creating all sorts of community activity at a distance. So for me, I think it's a mixture of, this incredible scientific advance in record time. And I think, one of the people I'm going to be interviewing shortly just said, look, if we've done this extraordinary work against COVID so quickly, imagine what we're going to do against the flu in the next year or two, or against malaria or any of those diseases. We've now got the tools and the vaccines that will solve some of these intractable problems. And then the courage and support of the frontline workers. And then I think the common sense of the ordinary people. You and I here in Australia, we look at these incredible statistics on COVID deaths and COVID illness across Europe and the United States and India and the like. And yet in Melbourne, there's 3 cases of community transmission. In Sydney, there's a few. So the common sense of people in sticking to the distance and wearing masks and just cleaning their hands, I think you're inspired by the everyday person.
Now I want to divert to the world of business and looking at Australian businesses. You mentioned it before about your organisation being predominantly digital over the last 12 months. How have you seen Australian businesses really bridging that gap between the physical and digital? And there's a term floating around called phygital, to really create that growth in their organisations?
Oh, it's been really patchy, I guess. One of the interesting, it's a government-owned business, is Australia Post. I think a year ago we all looked at Australia Post and said how unbelievable it is that we're paying more and getting less. And their parcel delivery service was awful. They seem to have really, stepped up to, on their cars now you see powering the, I think, digital commerce or something like that. So you see, number one, the distribution businesses of Australia really stepping up and improving. And that's a matter of opportunity. When I lived in San Francisco, you could order from Amazon and, stuff would arrive the next morning on your doorstep. I think we've seen more of that in Australia. And then secondly, the use of Zoom. I think everyone's over-Zoomed, but the movement towards video conferencing and, when you look at, say, the Melbourne-Sydney air route, which was famously, the 3rd busiest air route for planes up until COVID, how many Melburnians are going to fly to Sydney for a 1 hour meeting, or how many Sydney-siders are going to fly to Melbourne for a 1 hour meeting, unless it really needs face-to-face communication. So I think we're going to see changes in that. But I think to see the way people have stepped up and been able to communicate from their phones. So call centres, for instance. I mean, I'm on the board of a utility, Yarra Valley Water, which already had one of the highest rated call centres in the utility sector. We had to rapidly transform to allowing our workers to work from home. And, the customer satisfaction with our call centre actually went up with our workers working from home. So, the legend that call centres work better when everyone's in the same sort of battery hen environment, might not necessarily be true. If you don't need to sit in the traffic for 2 hours and, as a woman, you don't need to get dressed up and maked up, etc. And you can go walking in the garden, or you can do all sorts of things and, step up to your desk when it's time to start work. I think Australian business has been really good at that part of the digital economy and enabling its workers to work from home. And then the retail sector, of course, all you've got to do is drive around the streets and see the empty shops. And the Centre for Optimism, we opened the world's first shop of optimism. Well, April, when the shutdown came in Melbourne, we had to shut the world's first shop of optimism. But, we found it relatively easy to move online, and I think a lot of people have. But I think, the world of retail business, it's very challenging for people, and I'm not an expert in that. But I think generally you look at the way Australian business has coped with the transition. I think people have done a pretty good job.
I was incredibly surprised. We've obviously been living in a rural community in New Zealand for the last 2 years, and have just come home for Christmas. And I ordered some things online for the kids, some beautiful organic cotton pajamas. I ordered them at 9 o'clock in the morning, received them by 3 o'clock by the most lovely delivery man that I've ever met. And then I was just incredibly surprised and delighted continuously of this incredible service by the organisation, because I went back to order some more things, and just the level of service and the level of care and the fast delivery. I couldn't believe that it was on the door within a couple of hours. And, never, maybe that's because I've been living in a regional community that I haven't seen that kind of service for a long time. But I was incredibly impressed on, all those different touch points of communication and how that really stepped up. And they really valued our support of buying Australian-made products that were made of Australian organic cotton that was produced here in Sydney. So
Yeah, no, that's spot on.
journey.
I ordered something from the Australian Design Centre. No, the most beautiful original design. Or George Hall, who's under the Coca-Cola sign in Sydney, with his optimist heart paintings. He's just one guy working in a shop on his own, or, with a few staff members. But, I ordered a new, print from him. It was on the doorstep within 2 or 3 days. My daughter wanted some stuff from Cotton On. It was delivered, I think, not the next day, but the day after. It's pretty efficient to get it, packed, boxed, and distributed so quickly. So I think, but of course, not every business can do that. It's can you be a part of a pick and pack distribution system and warehousing system? So, it varies. What I got from the Australian Design Centre, took a few weeks because it was a personalised design for the Centre for Optimism, but it was fantastic and beautifully delivered. And at the other end, the big business like Cotton On, as with your delivery, within a couple of days, it's on the doorstep and a friendly delivery.
And so what are some of those key topics of discussion that are really getting consistent airtime at the office of the Centre of Optimism? If there is still an office, let's just say, Victor.
So for us,
the digital office.
Yeah. So for us, it's having spent the first year building credibility and building activity level. It's what takes us to the next level. So number one, we've got a lot of people who want to volunteer. So, when I was in my early 20s, I was very good at organising volunteers. And, over the decades that followed, I always had people working for me who organised volunteers. So for me, number one is really helping the volunteers who want to help us. So that's probably number one. Number two is working out what way people want to be communicated in. I think email, it now overwhelms people. People just get too many emails that all look good and all look interesting, but it's just too much for people. So, I do a once a day WhatsApp dose of optimism that people a lot of people communicate back to me that they really like. We use LinkedIn, we use Twitter. So in a world where people are overwhelmed with messaging and sales messaging, I come back to a book that was written by one of my board members, John Hagel, about 10 years ago, called The Power of Pull. So I guess the second topic for us is, how do we draw people towards us? Then the third thing is, how do we help people to strengthen themselves? So obviously we encourage people to ask other people what makes you optimistic. We've just created our first online course, which is very entertaining. It's a animated Habits of an Optimist, where we've had a whole lot of really interesting high-profile people record the audio, and we've turned them into cartoon characters. So I guess the third step in education is micro-credentials. People are coming out of university not really equipped to do the calling that they've gone to university to be able to do. So micro-credentialing, from cybersecurity to optimism is important. So I could probably go on and on and on, because we've actually got a really active business committee. And so for us, I'd say it's those things. How do we make better use of the people who want to help us, and in doing that, empowering them. Secondly, how do we communicate in a way that doesn't overwhelm people? Because we're producing so much new material, it's easy to overwhelm people with what we do. And then thirdly, that question of the power of pull. How do we draw people towards us rather than drive them nuts by sending out messages? And I think that's a challenge to every business. How do you get attention with something worthwhile? And then there's probably another 25 topics we talk about. And I'm sure you're going to ask me a good question about those, Catherine.
So finally, thinking about economic freedom, and to be honest with you, the word freedom has been continuously coming up in conversations, things that I've been reading towards the end of last year and also this year. What does economic freedom look like in Australia in 2021 and moving forward?
Well, that is a really interesting question. And I think we probably turn to the global as well. Well, my family, my mother, who died last year in October, lived under Stalin and Hitler. And when she arrived in Australia, she still goes back to thinking, God, here's a country where you can say bloody Menzies. Robert Menzies was the Prime Minister of Australia then, and not go to jail. So the number one in economic freedom is freedom of communication. And I think there are difficulties in Australia around that now. One of the habits of the optimist is humour. So people are really, in olden times, when I was young, 40, 50 years ago, a lot of the humour was good humour, but it was based on ethnicity, it was based on sexism, and women would tell jokes about men and men about women, and, Jews would tell good jokes about Jews, and the Irish would tell good jokes about Irish. The younger generation doesn't quite get that humour. And so that there's a sarcasm, a sort of a nasty humour that comes from American reality shows and the competition shows. So I think the number one problem in economic freedom at the moment is how to communicate and what to communicate, and how best to express it. So without people being excessively censored in the workplace or elsewhere. So I think that's number one for me. Number two, with economic freedom, obviously, we've had the problem of shutdowns. And I did a radio interview sort of middle of 2020 on The journalist said to me, "Oh gosh, Australian businesses never had such difficulty." And I said, "Well, have a bit of a think about it. We have people who were refugees from Europe in the 50s where everything was destroyed by bombing and the like. And now we have refugees from Iran, Iraq, Syria, etc. And the same, their businesses were destroyed by bombing or terrorism or the like. And, they've come to Australia and they've set up new businesses. And then in Australia itself, we've had people whose businesses have been destroyed by bushfire and flood and cyclone. So again, is government shutting down business for public health reasons a breach of economic freedom? I think it's probably a good discussion to have, and you and I could probably spend an hour on that. Thirdly, the regulatory side of business, I think it's increasingly difficult. We're rebuilding the family monument at the cemetery. We actually need planning approval now to build a monument in a cemetery. And you've got to say it's not like there's someone who's going to be living under the monument whose life is going to be in danger. So, in all goodwill, we've got workplace safety regulation and the like that's becoming ever more threatening. So in Victoria, for instance, you've got industrial manslaughter laws, where people, may end up going to jail, being convicted of a criminal offence for things that were outside the ambit of the criminal law. So I think that's becoming more complicated. But I think when you set all of that aside, in terms of a society which is free, it's Australia. We've got no warfare. We've got very low levels of crime. We've got a community that's vibrant and generally freedom loving. So I think all of that stuff says we live in a really good space and a country that's relatively free. The threat, I suspect the biggest threat we have at the moment is from, a player like China, which, for strategic reasons has decided that it's going to have a go at Australia. It's going to have a go at the United States. It's going to have a go at Taiwan. It's going to have a go at Japan. It's going to have a go at Germany. I mean, the language they used against Germany in the Security Council of the United Nations 2 weeks ago was extraordinary. So for us, I guess we've got a really nasty dictatorship that's decided to have a crack at a number of Australian industries, like the seafood industry, the timber industry, and the like. And so to maintain our freedom, I think we're going to depend on the government and Austrade and our entrepreneurs to wake up to the fact that you can't rely on a nasty dictatorship to act in a fair way. And we've got to make sure that, when we're exporting our services and our goods, we don't throw our eggs into the one basket of a country, where its importers can be controlled by the government. So I think probably the greatest challenge to Australia's economic freedom is to make sure that we're trading and doing business with other people who value freedom. And, you look at some of the Victorian government advertising now around, buy local, support Gippsland cheese, support South Australian wine, buy local. And as you've said, Australian cotton can be delivered same day or next day. It's, let's do business with people who have the same values that we do, and, we'll enjoy our freedom and support other people's freedom too. That was, again, a long answer to a simple question, but there's immense complexity at the global strategic level now.
And we love that complexity, and then we can just break it down into nice and simple terms. And I think we may just have to do a sequel in the future. So thank you, Victor Perton, so much for sharing all of your world and wisdom with TradeSquare.
Oh, Catherine, you ask such good questions, and the work you are doing is just wonderful in lifting people. So all the best to you and to your colleagues to lead us through a period of entrepreneurship, innovation, and economic freedom. So thank you for what you do, and all the best.
For more information on TradeSquare, head to www.tradesquare.com.au and support Australian business economic recovery and growth with a collaborative approach to the future of business.